Hello, and welcome to Field Lab Earth, the podcast that's all about past and present advances in the fields of agronomic, crop, soil, and environmental sciences. Today, we'll be talking to Dr. Alexandria Kuhl about modeling for rooting depth and water use in biofuel crops. Biofuel crops can be used to create fuel from renewable plant materials. Corn is the most common example, but as research progresses, scientists are looking to expand their biofuel crop pool to include woody perennials and ornamental grasses. These plants have a lot of positives going for them, but with longer growing seasons going head-to-head with decreasing water budgets and increasing food needs, much research is still needed to ensure these biofuel rookies can stand the economic and environmental tests of time. This episode, Alex discusses her work creating novel modeling methods to study the impacts and potential of new and promising biofuel crops. Don't forget to listen to the end of the show for our student spotlight. I'm your host, Abby Morrison. Let's talk about science. Hi everyone, welcome to the show. Today we have Alex Kuhl with us. Dr. Kuhl graduated from SUNY Brockport with bachelor's degrees in physics and water resources in 2012 and went on to receive her PhD from Michigan State University in environmental geosciences in 2020. Following a postdoctoral scholar position at the University of Chicago and Argonne National Laboratory, she will be returning to Michigan State as a research associate with the Institute of Water Research in February of 2023. Hi, Alex. Welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
I'm great. Thanks for the invitation, Abby. How are you?
I'm doing super well. It's a beautiful fall day, nice and sunny, so very happy about that. So today we are going to be talking about biofuels and water use and root systems and soil physics and hydrology, all of that good stuff. So some of that gets pretty complicated. So I wanted to just have a quick chat about some definitions that will probably come up later. So we can just have those clearly identified before we get into the meat of the conversation. So the main one that I wanted to talk about was electrical resistivity. So can you go ahead and define that for us?
Yeah, sure. So electrical resistivity is kind of a very descriptive term for a geophysical technique. And geophysics is a kind of umbrella term, another kind of jargony term for a whole class of tools that have been used by geologists, geoscientists, or scientists for decades, actually, to study the Earth. Everything, like seismic studies, I think people are very familiar with. Seismology, tracking earthquakes, that kind of thing. Well, seismology is one type of geophysics. Electrical resistivity is kind of a different type of geophysics where we're using electrical methods to study the Earth. And the general way that it works is we're making an electrical signature of the soil by using a piece of equipment that functions just like it would if you were to take the voltage of your car battery, for example, or any battery. So it relies on the premise of Ohm's law. The voltage is equal to the current times the resistance. And so it's really just kind of what it sounds like is that, if we know the voltage and we know the current flow through a material, you can calculate the resistance of that material. So when that literally is how resistive that material is to the flow of current. So, think about in a thunderstorm, the things you would or wouldn't want to touch. So metals are very conductive, whereas things like plastic and wood are very resistive to current flow. And soil kind of falls in the middle. So the resistance, the property of a soil, the resistance of a soil is affected by the properties of that soil. And that's what makes electrical resistivity a really useful tool for studying properties of the soil at a scale. You can measure tens of meters or, a pretty large area pretty easily compared to other types of measurements. And so that's what makes geophysics generally pretty attractive for study and electrical resistivity in particular. And so what will be relevant for our discussion is that one of the properties that can really affect the resistivity of the soil is the amount of water. So we refer to that as the soil moisture, how much water is in the soil pores And that changes throughout the season as you have events like precipitation and evapotranspiration, basically the plants removing water from the soil, precipitation adding water. And so we go back and keep repeating our measurements of the electrical resistivity. We can basically use that as a proxy for how the soil moisture is changing. And that's what makes it useful for hydrologists.
So the way that a lot of this ties in is we are talking today about biofuel crops and kind of how they connect with water usage and water supply levels, which obviously ties in with like climate change and all that kind of stuff. And the need for fuel and while also protecting the climate and water supply and all that thing. It's kind of a big knotted web. So to help us maybe unravel that a little bit, can you give us an overview of just the state of the biofuel industry? What are some of the crops that are currently being used? How do we think that those affect water reserves? Why is that so important now? What's changing in the industry and how that relates even to other cash crops or other farming types that might be in similar areas?
Sure. So I'll back up a little bit and just define, I think, biofuel here, which is, for folks who don't know, it's kind of a generic term for any liquid fuel sourced from plant matter. And so the state of the science with biofuels right now is we have what are called conventional or first generation biofuels, which are plant materials made from a lot of sugary starches, primarily corn, ethanol. So that corn is literally the corn kernels. And then we also have things like sugar cane and sugar beets. But I think corn is far and away the most common biofuel source right now for this first generation or conventional source. And the way that we actually go from the plant to putting it in our gas tanks is that these sugars can be fermented to create ethanol, kind of akin to how we make, alcohol for human consumption. We're creating this ethanol, this type of alcohol, and then it's mixed with gasoline to make the fuel that's most commonly at the pump E10, which most today's vehicles are all built to handle. And so that literally is 10% ethanol mixed with gasoline. And where the biofuel biofuel use right now is that the issue is it burns. The good thing about biofuels and ethanol is that it burns cleaner than gasoline, and it's sourced from a renewable source like plant matter. The downside is that I think it hurts, and part of this is on the vehicle engine design too, but as you increase the amount of ethanol, your vehicle efficiency, your fuel efficiency goes down. And so the reason we're not just, putting 100% ethanol into our combustion engines is because then we wouldn't have a very efficient vehicle and it would kind of negate itself because you'd have to use so much. And the other issue is that all those grains I just listed, corn, sugar cane, sugar beets, those are also food sources. And so you've got this competition between our fuel source and our feedstocks, and especially where corn is concerned. And that's a big trade-off that we're trying to make. And so we obviously can't, we need to be growing more food, not less. So we can't really have this competition between them. And corn is also a pretty water-intensive crop. Whereas grown in the Corn Belt, for the most part, they can rely on the water that's available in the clay-like soil that's really prevalent in Illinois, Iowa, et cetera. But in areas that the water availability is lower, like in southern Michigan, you have to irrigate. And so the water use of corn is pretty high. And on top of that, again, it's competing with food sources, and where we're growing corn is like premium cropland. And so we don't really want to be using that to be growing. And the economics don't work either because we're paying a high price for the food. So where science is right now going is towards what's called the second generation, or the cellulosic biofuel. So now that's going from the sugar to actually the cellulose plant fibers, pretty much everything that's inedible. So think about everything on the corn plant that gets left behind after harvest, woody materials that grow really quickly, like from poplar trees, and other perennial grasses like that are, originally have been an ornamental grass like switchgrass and miscanthus that can become like 10, 11 feet tall, grow really fast. And excuse me, their water and nutrient input demand is a little bit lower than corn. So in addition to not competing with our food source, they also have the potential to be grown on land that's less suitable for growing crops economically. We call this marginal land. And so a lot of research is on how we might be able to grow these crops to not compete with food. But where the research is right now is that converting those cellulosic biofuels to ethanol is a lot more difficult and requires some advancements in the technology to go. Humans have been making ethanol from sugar for thousands of years, if not longer, right? But we haven't been doing that from just plant matter for a reason, and that's because it's really difficult. So there's a lot of research on coming up with an efficient, affordable technology to go from the cellulosic biomass to the ethanol at larger scales. And then finding another arm of the research is finding the species of these cellulosic biofuel crops that would be the most easily digestible and also grow with the highest use efficiency of water and nutrients. And then the third part, where me as an environmental focused scientist comes in, is understanding what the economic and environmental impacts are of growing those crops. Because they're different than what we've been growing. And I said corn uses a lot of water. If these crops use more, and we're already in a water limited kind of agricultural framework right now with the droughts we're seeing, I think this year right now we're in like historic levels of drought in the Southwest and in the Central Plains. So how are we going to navigate that if our solution to an alternative fuel is another crop that's going to require a lot of water?
That's a really great overview of kind of all of the issues that are at play, but then you had a specific experiment that you were conducting related to this larger problem. So can you lay out kind of what your main research goals were and hypotheses, and then how you went about testing it?
Sure. Yeah. So to kind of address one of these questions, again, I was coming in from as a hydrologist with a interest in studying the effects on the water resources and also technically, I have a background in physics, and I was really excited to use geophysical tools and felt like there was a lot of promise there for addressing this question of the water use and of these different plants. We wanted to, our goal with the research that's published in this paper, and that's kind of the premise for this conversation today, is to use different geophysical measurements coupled with hydrological measurements, so measurements of the soil moisture, for instance, and to see if we could develop a modeling framework that would allow us to estimate the plant root depth and the plant root water uptake of these different crops. And then we wanted to compare those for different, like these perennial biofuel grasses, specifically like miscanthus and switchgrass, and comparing those to some more conventional grown crops like corn and soybean and canola. And the motivation for studying those two different plants specifically for this research was that perennial crops are not grown from seed each year. That's kind of what perennial means, right? And so they start growing earlier in the season because you don't have to wait for the seed to germinate, et cetera. And then they're harvested later as well. And so their roots are staying intact, growing all year round, and you have this is a sharp contrast to these annual crops, where often you may have, if you're not doing a cover crop, you're going to actually have bare ground for at least half the year or so. And so that we hypothesize, and there is evidence already in the literature to show that just dichotomy there is going to create a difference in the water budget alone. And so we wanted to not just take measurements to see if we could quantify how different they were, but we wanted to use the modeling part. And this is kind of, I think, where this is a key difference in this study, is we wanted to use the modeling part to actually see if we could quantify exactly which pieces of the water balance were different and why. And we thought the model would be able to tell us that. So that was kind of the setup for why we wanted to do the particular experiment that we did on these biofuel crops.
Okay. I'm going to sneak in an extra question here before you tell us more about how you went about it. You mentioned that you wanted to estimate like the rooting depth, and I understand like the measuring how much water they're uptaking. Is that like directly related to rooting depth, where like deeper or longer roots are going to take more water? Like, what is the relationship there?
Definitely. Yeah, that's a great question. So Yes, exactly. The idea is that roots can only remove water from where they are. And so if you're in kind of a water limited environment, you typically have much deeper roots because they need to have a longer root length to access more water, especially in drought conditions. So in more wet conditions, you have pretty shallow roots because they're not really water limited, and so they don't need to put energy into growing roots. So I think we need to remember that plants are kind of like humans, always, and like any animal, really are kind of optimizing their use of the limited energy that they have to thrive. And so they're going to only grow roots where they really have to maintain enough water to survive. And so what we actually did was, because measuring roots is a really challenging aspect, as you can imagine, you have to very carefully excavate a plant, and then the roots can be very much of the actual root length. The root biomass is in very fine fibers, and those are really challenging to difficult. So that was part of our motivation for using the geophysics and this kind of modeling technique as well, was because the physical excavation of them is very difficult. So we kind of were working towards some novel methods that can aid with that. And we were really looking at using the monitoring of the soil moisture changes, we thought were an indicator of how deep those roots were. So if our resistivity data is showing us water is being removed at, say, 1.5 meters depth, and the physics of the system dictates that it's not just because the water is being drained under gravity. There's some other process that's removing that water. We're inferring that it's because there are roots present to that depth. So that was kind of how we were using the geophysics and the soil moisture as a proxy for getting at the root depth itself, which is an important phenological question. Different crops have different rooting depths because they've adapted for different environments. And then the same crop can have vastly different root structure depending on the type of soil and the climate that it's in as well. So it's a rather complicated area of ecology, for sure.
Sure. Oh, that's so interesting. I'm so impressed by scientists. So thank you for everything that you do. You guys are so smart and clever, which I know that. I already know that, but I'm like regularly reminded and re-impressed by scientists. Very happy to get to do this job. So then how did you kind of boots on the ground go about doing your research?
Yeah, sure. So we had the advantage at Michigan State of having the WK Kellogg Biological Station located nearby. So this is a field site down in Southwest Michigan that was actually donated by Kellogg of Kellogg cereal. I don't know when, but it was a while ago. And so it's been this amazing resource for research, because I guess I don't know how big it is, but it's hundreds of acres, and they have the ability to study biology, all kinds of biology and ecology studies. There's a lake nearby, so there's freshwater science going on, animal science, plant science. And so specifically, we worked at the one of the Great Lakes Bioenergy Research Center field sites that is established at the Kellogg Biological Station, or KBS as we refer to it. And before I actually joined the program at Michigan State, a colleague had gone and set up an experiment where they installed a bunch of probes at the biofuel research plots. And so these plots are really cool. They kind of look like a patchwork quilt. You can go on, if you look at Google Maps satellite view, you can see at these study fields where you basically have these, I think they're like 20 meter by 12 meter on a side. Plots all right next to each other, growing all of these different crops and replicates. So we have like the poplar, the tall grasses, the corn, etc. And a lot of other scientists have been doing experiments on these plots for, I think, going on at least a decade now, studying things that I alluded to earlier in biofuel research, like the economics, the water use efficiency, the how much biomass they're actually producing, which particular genetic phenotypes work better or worse, those kinds of things. So lots of awesome research going on there. And so we had installed these probes to be able to measure the soil moisture directly in each of our different crop types. And then we also had installed, and this was kind of a novelty at the time, was we had put the probes that were necessary to do the electrical resistivity measurements. We actually buried those in the ground and wired them up in a way that would allow us to go back every 2 weeks and take measurements in the exact same locations. And what this meant was that we really could be confident that the changes we were seeing every between one measurement and the next were really only due to changes in the soil properties themselves, because all of our probes are in the exact same location. And that was really an awesome part of this. So we did that for, I think, 3 years, from 2009 to 2011 in the growing season. So we have this vast amount of geophysical data, which, think about it, and this is where the data fusion piece comes in, and I get really excited, is that the electrical resistivity data, I think I alluded to earlier, allows you to measure at larger scales pretty quickly. So you can imagine you're getting a large spatial coverage, so many measurements in space, but you're only doing it every 2 weeks because of limitations of personnel, and you have to be out there with a battery running. It's kind of a limited ability to run autonomously, but you get lots of spatial measurements at once every 2 weeks. Our soil moisture probes, which rely on a different type of technology, are wired into a system and work automatically. They collect a measurement every half an hour, but only in one little point location. And so we kind of have this trade-off between these two types of measurements, between high temporal resolution, high spatial resolution, low temporal resolution. And so our idea with coupling our data types in the modeling framework I alluded to earlier is to take advantage of the strengths of both by using their kind of complementary scales to give us a lot of information and really play up the strengths of each. So we went out there and we collected all of this data. And then we also had, for example, other inputs for the modeling, like the precipitation that was happening at the site every day, air temperature, weather we had a weather station. And so we have all of these inputs that we can use to look at the water budget and to build our model, to build inputs for our model. And yeah, that was kind of how we got our field data. And then a lot of the work I did in my PhD was actually in developing the code that would take in these different data types and kind of couple them together in this cool new way that was really had in the agrogeophysics or hydrogeophysics community had been proposed and used in theory in a few cases. But I think we were kind of at the forefront of using it with field data. And so we're really excited about that.
Hi, everyone. I hope you're enjoying the show. Interested in learning more? Alex's paper, Root Water Uptake of Biofuel Crops Revealed by Coupled Electrical Resistivity and Soil Water Content Measurements, published in Vadozone Journal, is always freely available. It was published as part of the Vadozone Journal special section, Agrogeophysics, Geophysics to Investigate Soil-Plant-Atmosphere Interactions and Support Agricultural Management. We'll have a link to both in our show notes. If you are a certified crop advisor or certified professional soil scientist, you can take a quiz for continuing education units for this episode, which can be found on our show notes or on certifiedcropadvisor.org. Let's get back to the show. Well, wonderful. Thank you for that really thorough explanation. I think that makes everything really clear, which is always great with anything with physics for me.
Don't worry.
So I really appreciate it. You're doing a great, excellent job explaining everything. So then what did you find?
Yeah. So when I'm looking back, this paper came out a while ago. I was like, what did we find? Right. So the primary result, I think, for us was twofold. We had this technical side with the data coupling and the modeling results. And we showed that this electrical resistivity, this geophysical technique, was really highly sensitive to the temporal changes. So across the growing season, the time changes in those soil moisture conditions, and also to the root properties. And that's what was like really new, was the looking at the root properties themselves and seeing if we could actually back those out of our data, even though we weren't measuring roots specifically. in a physical way. And so that was really the one major outcome, is that we were actually sensitive to those properties and showed a way in which that could be, you could use a modeling framework like this to look at these really hard to measure properties like roots and the soil properties at large depths and spatial scales. And then for the plant scientists, we're trying to come up with new tools. Like I said, measuring roots by hand is very difficult. So coming up with new tools to answer fundamental questions about like plant phenology and these hydroecological processes related to water use and water budgets. And so we did find ultimately that our results showed and agreed with the literature that those perennial biofuel grasses would actually alter the water balance by drawing that water earlier and longer than the annual crops. But it wasn't necessarily because of having differences in their root distribution. So we didn't really see large differences between the perennial and the annual crops that we looked at. We looked at a rotation of corn, soybean, canola was our kind of comparative case or control in this scenario. But we saw that the root systems of the grasses in the 2009 was a drought year. And we saw that those roots looked very different in that drought year. And so that was kind of cool. But in terms of what the processes were, it was just the leaf area, or the amount of, I guess, think of it as every plant has leaves, and the surface area of that leaves is proportional to how much water they can remove, because where the water leaves the plant is through the leaf surface. And so that seemed to have more of an effect than the roots themselves, based on our modeling, the way our model had been developed to show us where the piece. And that's the cool thing about modeling. I'll just plug, I'm a modeler, so I'm going to get excited about this part. But the cool thing about modeling is you can actually see the numbers of where things are, because it's all physically a mechanistic based representation of the field. So that was, I think, our kind of take home for sure.
Well, those are wonderful results, obviously super helpful, and I'm also very pleased you can explain models really clearly, because that's my other weak point in it's one of those topics that's always really difficult for me to wrap my head around. So thank you for that. And you also mentioned in our conversations for preparing for this that there was kind of like a big surprise that you found in your research results. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. So I think, and many modelers maybe would agree that maybe this part of it isn't such a surprise, is that actually going from concept to implementation was harder than we thought it would be. We thought we'll kind of waltz in there and build this hydrological model, and the geophysics data would just look great, and it would all be easy peasy, and it was not. Even though natural systems are obviously complex, and a model is a simplification of that, and that still can add a lot of value, I believe, because like I said, you can understand those physical processes that are driving the behavior that you're observing. The issue was we were observing things that our model was not capturing. So we had to kind of go back to the drawing board and say, all right, what are we not seeing here? What's affecting our resistivity data that's beyond these plant water interactions? And one piece of this, and we knew this one, so this one wasn't a surprise, but temperature also actually affects the resistive properties of anything. So hot, things that are hot conduct ions faster than things that are cool. Likewise, as the temperature changes, I think it's something like every 1 degree Celsius of temperature change, you get like a 2% change in your resistivity measurements. So we were accounting for that. So we knew, okay, well, that's not the issue. We've got that baked in there. But then through conversations with some of our colleagues, we realized that the geological history of Southwest Michigan is informed very much by glacial movement. And if you go back even further, you have a lot of carbonate minerals in this area because of ancient oceans. And so it turned out that in the process of the glaciers, a lot of this carbonate minerals had gotten kind of churned up and deposited at the surface. And so what we had at depth, not where we were measuring, say we're looking at things happening in the top 1.5 meters. So pretty shallow. What we had going on at 2 meters and below was actually all of these carbonate minerals that were being dissolved by carbon dioxide in the soil water, which is acidic and was actually dissolving these carbonate minerals. So like calcium and magnesium, basically. Think about seashells, right? All right, we have these seashells that are getting dissolved. And what that did was released a lot of ions into the soil water, which you can imagine perhaps made the soil water very conductive, thereby reducing our resistivity in a way that we were not anticipating. And so we kind of had to go back to the drawing board. And I joke that this was years 4 and 5 of my PhD. We're just lost in this black hole of adding this kind of awesome geochemical component to our modeling framework, because it turned out that was affecting our results a lot. So that was both a really kind of eye-opening surprise. And I think, as our co-author mentioned, that if there was a place we wanted to get data after the fact about the pore water chemistry, there was no better place we could have been than at KBS, because they actually had pore water chemistry data that we could use to validate our model implementation of this geochemical carbon dioxide driven dissolution processes. And so I said earlier, I'm not a biologist. I also am not a geochemist. And so it was fun to get this kind of crash course in incorporating all of these complex processes. And the take home was really just like anything, these tools like geophysics are really powerful, but you've got to be careful you're getting the right answer for the right reason, because we had obviously things that were affecting our results a lot that we had to take into account.
Wow, that's amazing. That's so exciting. Rest in peace, years 4 and 5. But wow, what amazing results. That's super cool. So as I was reading your paper, I did have a question, and I feel like this kind of question comes up a lot for me, which is, so is this what you've developed now, like a functioning working model that, I mean, obviously you'd have to alter it because not every place has, dissolved seashells, for example. But is this like the foundation of a working model that other people can then use and adapt for their circumstances? Or is this more just like, here's how to take measurements for your own purposes and needs, and here's ways to collate data that you might have access to? And just kind of giving them the tools to do it themselves. What is the line there? Or maybe it's both. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's probably more towards the latter. We didn't get it into the kind of shape where it's like an off-the-shelf, plug in your numbers and get your results kind of thing. It was very much a proof of concept, I think, for us. Is pretty early, I think, in the field of hydrogeophysics or agrogeophysics in the modeling, I think, is pretty young, on the order of maybe a decade or so, that we've really been able to have the computational power to do this kind of research, and the interest in the water and the crop kind of intersection. And so it's not off the shelf, I wouldn't say, but we did use pretty publicly available, everything was kind of open source. The geophysical and the hydrological modeling were 2 open source models that pretty much anyone could combine in this framework and look at these parameters. And so depending on your research question, you could very much, I think, follow the model that follow the template that we kind of provided here. And in theory, it should be applicable in most environments where you're looking at these research, any kind of water, plant, these kinds of research questions.
Cool. That's super awesome. Developing like the cutting edge. I love that. So then, speaking of the cutting edge, what are some areas of future research, whether that's for biofuels or models that are similar to this, the water use? Where is the biofuel industry going with this?
Yeah, so I think and I've been out of the biofuel research area for a few years, so I'll say this kind of in a little surface level way, but I think the biofuel industry is really focused mostly on making the economics and the technology make sense. I think some of the criticisms of the biofuel sector right now is just that it economically doesn't make sense for farmers to grow these things. There's not currently a market to take in, even if you were to grow a biofuel right now, there's not really the refineries or places where these things are processed are kind of few and far between, and the shipping it to the places where it needs to be, all of that infrastructure just isn't quite there yet because the incentives aren't there. So I think that has shifted the focus in the research a little bit to almost be more, okay, we need to find a way to refine these things. And there's a lot of research now, and one area it's kind of shifted to is actually using algae, which is a plant that seems we're very good at growing in lots of places. But, how can we use that as a biofuel as well? And so I think a lot of the biofuel research that you'll see, like on Department of Energy's website, for example, in biofuel research is more in like the technical pieces. But for myself, I think the modeling is a really cool way to address any ecological question. It could be applied to biofuels, but also to anything. I think I have the next thing I'm excited about is applying this method to another ecological question that's not biofuel focused, but is focused on water use and land use change. So yeah, I don't know. That's not answering the question very well.
But. No, it's doing a wonderful job of answering the question. And I was about to ask what your next future research project is. So I don't know if you want to share a little bit more of a sneak peek, or if you're just going to keep that close to the chest. It is up to you.
Oh, well, I'll do a little sneak peek, but basically I think, as I alluded to, the next thing we have in the pipeline on this is that we had applied this modeling approach to a wooded study site to look at the effect of, either reforesting or deforesting areas like in Michigan. And again, one surprise we found was the effect of the woody root mass. So roots, again, affecting another scenario where it turns out there's something else in the soil that can affect your resistivity signature beyond what you were expecting. And it turned out that the woody roots themselves seem to have this really large effect. And so we're excited. We're working on writing that up now. And I think that's going to have an effect on how we think about applying geophysical tools in different areas for different ecological questions. It's becoming clear to me anyway, as a scientist, that we really need to think about the kind of the holistic system. And that even if your question is only 10% of the process, you actually got to be thinking about the whole process to get at the right answer.
Oh, I love that. That's so exciting. Well, I'm very happy for you and your team as you are moving forward and tackling all of these important questions. I have 3 questions left for you. The first one is, if someone would like to learn more about any of the topics we talked about today, where can they go?
Yeah, sure. So I think the best resource is actually looking at the U.S. Department of Energy, or DOE websites. They are the ones who support a lot of the preeminent biofuel research, both at the national labs and the universities. And so they're just an excellent resource. There's also the Great Lakes Bioenergy Research Centers. I know you guys are based in Wisconsin. I've been in Michigan and Illinois and things. And so those are kind of near and dear to my heart. I know they have a couple of these field sites established. And so they have a website as well, where they discuss all the research that's going on and like the research that we discussed today. And so you can find, I think we'll have links included for those. And then another place I would suggest readers go is that the article we talked about today was actually part of a special section at Veto's Own Journal, I think titled Geophysics, Conquering New Territories, the Rise of Agrogeophysics, which I just love. And there's a nice there's a bunch of different articles, including ours, that cover a whole range of applications of geophysics for agriculture. But there's one particular kind of introductory manuscript that I think I've got a link to as well. That's just a great overview for people who might be excited about novel applications of tools, because I just think that there's a need for tools to study the subsurface as we're really trying to optimize and minimize our environmental impact. We just need to have more information about what's going on so that we can make the right choices as decision makers and about how to manage our land and our resources.
Absolutely. Thank you for those. Those are some great resources, and we will for sure include links for those in our show notes. Second question is, if people then want to take the next step and get involved with any of these topics, what can they do?
Sure. So if you're really gung-ho about this and kind of want to see your career here, I personally think that as the future of oil and gas gets a little bit more geopolitically complex and uncertain, I see the demand for people with expertise and interest in renewable energy, not just biofuels, but wind, solar, those things increasing. And so, and I also think the U.S., our greatest resource is our land, and that we're well suited to take advantage of that for wind, solar, and crops, be it both for supporting food and biofuels. And so if you're interested in careers, I actually, when I was looking around, DOE has a great interactive page where you can actually look at opportunities within the biofuel and in renewable energy sector, regardless of your vocation, everywhere from technicians up to, top tier research, everything in between. There's a role, I think, that you can play in moving us towards a renewable energy future. And the most powerful way, I think this it comes up a lot, but is to show your support for sustainable and renewable energy with your vote and your dollars. So supporting candidates who are clear that they want to invest in the research and development of these technologies, calling your congressmen and women and letting your representatives and letting them know you'd like to see those investments being made. Are kind of the probably the biggest way to have your voice make a difference here. But then there's also options like flex fuel vehicles, which can handle higher mixes of ethanol. I think they go up to like the E85, I believe, or E15. And so you're looking at more of like an 15% blend. Things like that are choices you can make in your day-to-day to support this field.
Wonderful. Well, those are all some really great ways for people to get involved. Final question for you. What is one fun fact that listeners would not know about you if all they had was your research?
Sure. So I was trying to think what something fun that maybe doesn't come up. And one thing I think about me that's kind of rare is that I'm an avid track and field fan, which is not a professional sport that garners a lot of attention internationally or in the US, but I am. And so like one of the things on my bucket list is to either go to an Olympic Games or World Championships someday. And so like, I think I'm pretty retired from running myself, but I still follow my high school team, see what they're up to, and keep up on like different professional runners and how they're doing. And actually I was really excited to be able to go. I'm living in Chicago right now. And I was actually able to go watch the Chicago Marathon in person and was able to root for the runners there and saw the women's American record got broken by a runner who placed second place. And then the first place runner in the women's division missed the world record by like 14 seconds. So it was like super exciting for me. It was like a perfect fall day. And I was like, all right, this is the peak of being a running fan right now. Is out here actually being a part of the spectacle. Yeah.
Did you have like a specific event that you frequently did in high school?
Yeah, I was a 400 and 800 meter runner mostly. Ooh. And I did do cross country, even though it was a little painful for me to run the full 5K.
Yeah. Yep. Wow, those are some tough ones. So wonderful. Well, this has been an excellent conversation. I am so pleased to learn about your research, both past and future. And thank you for everything that you are doing and for being on the show.
Yeah, well, thanks, Abby, for the invitation. I was really delighted to get to share my research and just chat with you guys and be a part of the podcast. After seeing your invitation, I had started listening, and I was just so impressed by what a great, I think it's my new favorite way to ingest science content that really got me out of like kind of the looking up papers, reading papers, actually listening to scientists talk for 40 minutes about and share their expertise has just been a lot of fun for me as a listener too.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Glad we're helping you out.
For sure.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Student Spotlight, where we highlight the work of graduate and undergraduate Society student members. Today, we'll be talking to Bailey. Welcome to the show. Can you start us off by introducing yourself and where you're studying?
Hi, my name is Bailey Tangen, and I'm studying in Minnesota at the University of Minnesota. I am a graduate student in the Water Resources Science program. I work in the Minnesota Office for Soil Health with Dr. Anna Cates. Minnesota has such wonderful nutrient-rich soils and is a really important part of the Midwest corn and soybean belt.
Wonderful. And what are you currently researching?
I study soil at farms. I study how water moves through soils and what makes a soil stay intact even when there are big disturbances like rainfall and tillage. In Minnesota, we will get more extreme weather, such as wet springs. Farmers are already limited in their field season here because of our long cold winters, so increasing rainstorms will delay fieldwork. This will cause additional stress for farmers. So this project is looking at how field management impacts when a farmer can work in their fields and the effects on their profits. We're using a survey to ask farmers how weather variability factors into farmer quality of life and mental health. What's cool is that this project stems from conversations with working farmers, and we get to do most of our sampling at real operating farms.
Great. And if you could have your dream research project, what would that be?
I like research that tackles important problems facing society today. And I really like soil and I really like water, so studying these together is fun for me. I'm really curious about the pores in the soil. So some holes, very simplistic. There's different size pores in the soil and they change throughout the growing season. So I'd like to help make predictions of water behavior in soils at a larger scale than just the field. And I think it would be fun to study redoxomorphic features. Have you ever seen those polka dot colors in the soil? The bright red and depleted gray dots? That's what redox is. And it's telling us that there's water sitting here in the layer for some parts of the year. Water does some weird things in soil, which I think is awesome. So I'd like to help us make better predictions and understand this as our precipitation patterns are shifting. I'd also like to help how we can make folks connect to soils more deeply.
Awesome. If you'd like to get in touch with Bailey about her work, we'll have her contact information in our show notes. Thank you so much for being on the show today, and best wishes on your future studies and career. Thank you. Thank you for listening to Field Lab Earth. More information can be found in the description below. Thank you.